Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's session of the Galileo Virtual Conference webinars that we are hosting this June. This morning, we're going to have our keynote address, Understanding the Landscape of Library Accessibility. I'm Joy Wilson, and I work at Galileo. I do marketing and communications there. And Hannah Rosen and Jill Grogg from Lyricist will be on the line. Hannah is a strategist with research and scholarly communication, and Jill is a strategist also in the same area, but focusing on content and scholarly communication initiatives. And so we do have both Jill and Hannah on the line if they want to say good morning and go ahead and kick us off.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having us this morning.
Yes, thank you for being here. We just wanted to briefly turn our cameras on so you could see a face to go with the disembodied voice, but we'll turn our cameras off here in just a second so as not to take up too much bandwidth.
Yes, it would be much cooler if we were disembodied voices, but we are unfortunately people. So I think Jill is going to kick us off with the beginning of the presentation.
Yes, indeed. So I'll turn my camera off. And as Joy indicated, if you have questions during the presentation, we will periodically just pause and see if anything has popped up. And if you want to wait until the very end, that's perfectly fine as well. So thank you all for joining us today to talk about web accessibility. This is a topic about which Hannah and I have become rather passionate over the past year to year and a half as we learn more and more about it and hear more from our members and others in the library community. I wanted to share briefly that we were certainly not experts coming into the notion of web accessibility. I shared with Hannah recently that before my very first library job, which now was 19 years ago at a university, after I had accepted the position, they called me and asked me if I would be the new copyright expert at the library because the person who had previously been in charge of that particular area of expertise had left. So I spent about 2 months prior to my beginning that position finding every online tutorial I could about copyright and learning about it. So I think library accessibility and web accessibility in particular is like many things in our jobs, insofar as it sometimes gets maybe dumped in our laps, or it's something about which we find ourselves having an interest and we just learn more about it as we go along. I think many of us are familiar with those types of challenges and areas of librarianship that we have to deal with. Next slide, Hannah. So while it's challenging to make online sessions with many participants interactive, we'd like to try and engage you as much as possible today. So in that vein, please consider your answer to this question as we move through our presentation. Recently, I've attended a couple of presentations where they tried to prompt people to think about specific or concrete actions they could take after the end of the presentation. And I've always appreciated that, as it allowed me to think about, well, what can I do after hearing this content today? So what can you specifically do after today's session? And it doesn't have to be anything enormous, like learn everything there is about accessibility. Maybe it could be just something as simple as look at the sum of the resources that we present later on today. Take a look at the accessibility survey report, even if it's just the introduction and conclusion that Lyricist published as a white paper last year. Maybe it's just talk with colleagues about what your policies are or something along those lines. So nothing enormous, but what kind of concrete actions can you take after today's sessions? And if we have time, we'd like to hear from you about the kinds of things that you might want to do after our session today. So next slide, Hannah. Unfortunately, I'm getting a swirling thing, so I can't see if the slide has
Yeah,
advanced.
it's not exactly working, so maybe I will hit stop presenting and I will share my screen. Hold on one moment.
It's always the challenges of presenting online.
Okay. Can you see this now?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Hannah. That was quick troubleshooting.
You're welcome.
Wonderful. So this is our agenda for today over the next 35 to 40 minutes or however long you have questions. We're here to answer and discuss and talk about web accessibility in libraries. The first thing we're going to do is contextualize the definitions and parameters that we used for accessibility in order to create the 2019 Lyricist Accessibility Survey. Then we're going to highlight the survey results and analysis with some top-level thoughts and conclusions that we found after surveying our members, followed by a discussion of current accessibility initiatives, and then we're going to wrap up with a call to action. And what does library accessibility mean for us, and why is it important? Again, we're happy to answer any questions that may arise during the course of our presentation. And again, we've left time at the end for questions as well. So next slide. With the evolution of collections from tangible formats to digitized ones, libraries really are charting new territory to make sure that their collections are accessible and are increasingly focused on how to adhere to both institutional policies and legal accessibility requirements. Between January and March 2019, Lyricist surveyed its members to determine how libraries are meeting this challenge, and then in July 2019 of last year, we released a white paper, the Lyricist 2019 Accessibility Survey Report. The Lyricist survey was focused on web accessibility rather than physical spaces. And the Association of Research Libraries Web Accessibility Toolkit provides a broad definition of web accessibility, which you see here. Web accessibility means creating digital resources on the web that everyone can use. This involves creating a web that is accessible to people with disabilities that may affect how they use the web, including but not limited to visual, auditory, physical, speech, cognitive, and neurological disabilities. Lyricist used this overarching definition of web accessibility in the survey creation and then subsequent analysis. I'd really like to highlight and stress that accessibility is a continuum, not an absolute. So if we look at a couple of the categories presented here, let's take something like visual accessibility. This can run the gamut from anyone who is completely blind through low vision, perhaps colorblind, even up to and including somebody who's forgotten their reading glasses that day. The same can hold true for hearing disabilities. This could again be complete deafness, perhaps some limited hearing abilities, limited range hearing, all the way and up to including no earbuds or headphones that day. Cognitive could include learning disability, distractibility, and other types of cognitive impairments that might be affecting your ability on that day to interact with material. So again, it's a continuum, not an absolute, and that's something we need to keep in mind when thinking about web accessibility. Very briefly, if you're not familiar with Lyricist, we are a member organization of more than 1,000 galleries, libraries, archives, and museums across the globe, with the majority of our members located in the United States. This survey, the accessibility survey, was specifically designed to gather information about the steps that libraries are taking to handle the accessibility of their content and assess where these libraries stand in terms of policy and implementation. And Hannah's going to provide more detail about the types of libraries who responded to our survey as well as the analysis. But to just contextualize where we see web accessibility fitting within the landscape of our library community, it sits at the center of a complex web, not to be reiterative there, for libraries, including but not limited to the following areas of librarianship. So at the top there, we see policy creation and adherence. We may have internal policies that are specific to the library. There may be institutional policies. Many of us receive our materials through different consortium, and they may have policies. So there's the process of creating those policies as well as the adherence to them. Additionally, we may be creating our content. If you have library publishing programs, you're digitizing materials for your special collections. You may have institutional repositories where you're placing content that's been created either internal to the library or on campus. We also have systems that we may be creating ourselves to handle the delivery of materials via the web, as well as content and systems that we purchase externally, about which we have less control, about which we have less control over how those materials are presented on the web. And Hannah will talk about that again a little bit later. We also have to deal with the issue of training library staff and patrons about how to both make materials accessible and access those materials in the most visible way for those particular patrons. And then last here, again, this is just some of the major ways that web accessibility affects our jobs. We also have licensing terms and conditions that can address what vendors and other publishers are doing to make sure their materials that we purchase are accessible for our library patrons. Next slide, Hannah. So in addition to policy creation, the content itself, whether we're creating it internally or purchasing it externally, the systems we create internally or purchase externally, training library staff and patrons, and any licensing terms we have to deal with, we also must understand and follow legal and community mandates. Legal mandates include the American with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and Sections 504 and 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The ADA requires any person, business, or organization covered under the Act to make information that they provide accessible to anyone. Now, the ADA is a law that was signed in 1990, so it was written to address the accessibility of physical spaces, but it does apply to virtual spaces as well. This means that it has a lot of specific information and guidelines for organizations to follow to make their physical spaces accessible, but it doesn't provide specific information on making web content accessible. However, if it applies to your physical spaces as an organization, it also applies to your virtual content. And in just a second, we'll talk about how we've seen some lawsuits and other legal action that is using the ADA for our virtual spaces and web accessibility. The Rehabilitation Act is also a federal law, and it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in federal agencies, but also in programs receiving federal financial assistance. So if you get federal grants, this applies to you. Two specific sections often come up in relation to web accessibility. Those are sections 504 and 508. So both of these federal laws generally say that web content needs to be made accessible, but neither gives specific ways that you must do this. That's where something called the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template and Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG as an acronym there, come in. The Voluntary product accessibility template was developed to ensure that information and communication technology products such as software, hardware, electronic content, and support documentation meet and conform to the revised 509 standards for IT accessibility. And for any of you who are involved with electronic resources, you may have been through the process of gathering these types of VPATs or voluntary product accessibility templates from different vendors and publishers to make sure that the content we purchase and provide access to is accessible as possible and adheres to legal and community mandates like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Next slide, Hannah. Accessibility has real-world impact for libraries, and as we can see here, in 2019, California Community colleges faced a lawsuit about the accessibility of library materials, which will likely have long-lasting effects for libraries in this arena. And I encourage you to go take a look at the National Federation for the Blind, which is part of this lawsuit, to read more about how this possibly could affect a number of different libraries, especially regarding instructional materials. We point this out just to emphasize that this has real world impacts for us. And they used here the ADA, as we see here, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act as part of their lawsuits. So ADA lawsuits have grown steadily in the past 2 years, and higher education institutions simply have not been spared. Next slide, Hannah. This is just a list of other academic institutions that have been confronted with legal complaints and lawsuits over the past several years. Just as an example that this is not something that we can take lightly. And next slide, Hannah. It's not just educational materials. We throw this in to show you that ADA applies to all aspects of accessibility, including porn. This lawsuit alleges that Pornhub, RedTube, and YouPorn, not things I'm personally familiar with, are in violation of the ADA, and part of the ADA's goal is to provide full and equal enjoyment of a public accommodations, goods, services, facilities, and privileges. So with that thought in mind, I'll turn it over to Hannah for some more information about our survey results and analysis.
Thank you, Jill. We wanted to make sure everyone was awake before we actually moved into the survey results. So there were 3 questions that we wanted to ask in this survey. The first was, how many libraries actually have policies in place to handle online accessibility? The second was, what tools and training are at their staff's disposal to assist in these endeavors? And what mandates inform accessibility policies? So we really wanted to see sort of what kind of infrastructure was in place to execute and enforce accessibility. And we divided the survey up into 3 sections. So the first section was content acquisition, and that basically means any content acquired, created outside of your institution. So for example, for academic libraries, the most common things you might think about would be e-journal or e-book packages, or databases, basically anything that you have to purchase to provide access to your users. But at the same time, we didn't want to exclude open access resources. So for example, if your library supports an open access initiative like Knowledge Unlatched or Open Library of the Humanities, you are technically acquiring that content to be put into your system so that students or other users can access it more easily. The second section was content creation. And that basically means anything that your library is putting out there for its users that was created within your institution. So in terms of scholarly communication, that might be theses, dissertations, any open access journals that your library might be publishing. As Jill said, anything that falls under library publishing, even audio or video recordings of class sessions or open educational resources. In terms of special collections or archives, archives. That might mean digitized manuscripts, digitized photographs, basically anything that your institution has ownership of and presents on the web to the world. And finally, we also wanted to have a distinct section on systems, because the purchasing and decision making around what systems you use to present your information online also affects the capability of conforming to accessibility standards. So basically, any software that you as a library would purchase to present your materials on the web, that would mean your library catalog. That would mean any digital asset management system, any content management system such as ArchiveSpace. So basically the systems, or just the library website in general, any systems that you choose also have an accessibility component. So when we performed this survey last year, we were able to get 155 usable responses. As you can see here, the majority of the responses did come from academic libraries, and that's not surprising considering the range of our membership. And the biggest group was doctoral universities, followed by master's colleges and universities, and then baccalaureate colleges. But we did get a small handful of other types of libraries. We got 4 museums, 4 independent archives, and then under other, we had a couple of actually K through 12 schools. We had several government libraries at different levels, local, state, and federal. We also had some consortia, some state libraries, and some other independent research institutions. So we felt, at least in terms of accurately representing our membership, that we got a good sample. So let's talk about some results. As I said, the first question we had was about policy. So we asked, does your institution have an accessibility policy for digital content acquisition? If you remember, this was anything that you have to purchase or acquire and bring into your library. And only 14% of respondents had a formal policy. Only 24% had an informal policy, and 39% said no, they have nothing. So that means that actually only 38% of respondents had any sort of policy, informal or formal, which was a little discouraging. The picture changed drastically when we asked about an accessibility policy in place that applies to the content you create and make available on the World Wide Web. This looks different because it is. 28% had a formal policy and 29% had an informal policy, and only 29% said no. So that actually means that almost 60% of respondents had some sort of formal or informal policy when it came to content creation. Now, finally, it changed again when we asked about systems. Only 12% of respondents had any sort of formal policy, and only 22% had an informal policy. That means only 34% of libraries had any sort of policy in place to determine which systems would be accessible for hosting content on the World Wide Web. And you can see here, 55% actually said that no, they had no policy. So that was a much higher negative response than the other 2 sections. What did we learn from this? Well, what we learned is that libraries are the most progressive in terms of accessibility when they maintain the most control over their content. So libraries, our mission is to make information available and accessible. Accessibility is a core part of what we try and do every day. And the survey really reflects that the more control we have, the more likely we are to actually fulfill that promise of accessibility. In terms, content creation had the highest number of formal and informal policies, and we take that as a sign that basically it has more to do with leverage than with desire. With content acquisition, we are negotiating with outside partners to get information to our users, which means often we don't have as much leeway in order to say yes or no to a particular resource. And we are at the beck and call of them, not only in terms of their information, but in terms of their platforms. We can ask, but how much we're able to enforce sort of depends on how much we need the resource. And oftentimes we are at a disadvantage. In terms of systems, we had several theories about why we had even fewer policies in place to handle systems. We can't make any definitive conclusions, but some thoughts that we had were, one, maybe because systems fall outside of our traditional training, librarianship is not naturally, well, I don't want to say that. I personally know from experience that a lot of librarians are not trained to understand software capabilities, and that's not our fault. That's just the nature of the job, was never intended to be IT necessarily. And therefore, we are not as able to properly evaluate our systems. But that's just one theory. It could also be that, like content acquisition, we are at the beck and call of our vendors or our open source softwares, that these things present themselves, there aren't a lot of options, and therefore, in the balance between trying to make information available and trying to have the properly evaluated systems, making information available often wins faster, often wins the battle. There may be other theories, we'd love to hear them, but those are sort of the results that we came to. We also asked as our second question, what training has been provided to help staff understand and implement your accessibility policy? And we lined up all three sections. You can see here that the most popular response is self-training, and that is probably one of the biggest hurdles to properly implementing accessibility policies around a library, is that most of us, like Jill, someone comes up and says, oh, by the way, can you do accessibility? Okay, thanks, bye. And then people are left to Google or to try and take online classes. Webinars and online courses are the second most popular form of training. But you can see that more institutionalized forms of training, in-person training from outside the institution or from external areas of the institution, or conferences and workshops, those are much smaller in terms of the percentage of people who have had access to that. Now, to go back to our theory that we're most progressive when we're in most control, in-person training from other staff is the second most popular form of training in the content creation section only, which means, once again, when it's our content, when we are able to control where it goes and how it's presented, we are actually teaching our colleagues how to do it properly once we have Googled it ourselves. But any kind of nationwide progress that gets us toward a more universal high standard of accessibility, I think is probably going to require more resources geared towards training. And finally, we asked which mandates inform your accessibility policy. And it's not surprising here that the mandates that are most popular are the national level and federally enforceable mandates. So the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 are the two most popular legal mandates. And WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, are the only ones that actually tell you how to do it. So these were very unsurprising results. The only thing that we'd like to point out is that the non-legal mandates really don't get much shrift. And that means that right now, the way we enforce accessibility is based on fear of legal repercussions, really. It's less to do with mission and more trying to just make sure that we're accessible so we don't get sued. There are a lot of other questions in the survey, and I will just go over a few of them now. One thing we found very interesting was we asked, do you have a timeline for implementing your accessibility policy? For basically all of the sections, most people said, well, we just have to be accessible now. But anything that doesn't meet accessibility standards right now, we'll just deal with retroactively. So once again, that really speaks to, I think, the fear that moves around accessibility, that oh, we have to get accessible now so that we don't get in trouble. We just have to do it. But we may not have time to process all of the legacy information that's still floating around in our system. We'll deal with that later. The other question we asked was, who is responsible for updating your accessibility policy and how often is it audited or updated? Very few people had an updating plan for their accessibility policy, which once again speaks, I think, to the rush that libraries have moved to try and codify accessibility in their institutions, that it's more important to get the accessibility policy up and running at this point. But not a lot of people have given any thought to who is actually going to make sure that this accessibility policy remains up to date. And this is actually a problem that we see in the Los Angeles Community College lawsuit, is that they were told you have to make your instructional materials accessible. And one of the things that the Los Angeles Community Colleges said was, well, a lot of our work is accessible to the level of WCAG 2.0. And the judge said that is not acceptable. It has to be 2.1. 2.1 had only been released for a couple of months, but it didn't matter legally. They just had to conform as quickly as possible to the newer standards. And that meant conforming in terms of all of their vendor resources, in terms of all their educational resources that they put online. But if you don't have a part of your policy that checks to make sure that it is the most up to date, that's going to be a problem, clearly. And most people are rushing so much just to get anything in place that that part has been neglected. So we're sort of interested to see how that changes over time as accessibility policies start being more frequently adopted. Then people will start to focus more on how to keep it updated and who is responsible for that. The other question we asked, which had some interesting answers, was how is your accessibility policy enforced? And this was all over the place. Some people said it was enforced by disabilities or accessibility departments outside of their library, especially if they were academic. There might be an ADA office. Some people said it was one person's responsibility. Some people said it was a committee. It was all over the place. And it just goes to show, once again, how new sort of formal web accessibility is to libraries. We've had digital materials for a long time, but the accessibility movement has swept in fairly quickly. And there's no one job position. You know, if you're thinking about acquisitions in an academic library, head of acquisitions or head of scholarly communication, you sort of know the job titles that are going to go with that. But with accessibility, it's still being developed. We're still at a very nascent period, which also means I just sort of want people to not be too alarmed by the results of the survey, because all it really means is that we're at the beginning. It's hopefully more of a guideline to say, here are some things you might want to think about if you are at the beginning of your accessibility story, essentially, as an institution. The survey says you're not alone. It says you're sort of at the same place as everybody else in this country. And that was one of the goals of the survey, to just show that in aggregate, you know, we're all sort of at the same place, but that we can move forward. So those are sort of the results of the survey. I'm going to hand it back over to Jill, who's going to talk about current initiatives that you might be interested in looking into.
So thank you, Hannah. Just to reiterate, many people are at the same place here, whether it's in academic institutions, public libraries, or other types of special libraries. I think it's important. One of the things that came out of the survey that was really critical for me and for us to communicate to our members is that we are in an infancy or toddler stage of accessibility, and we shouldn't feel alone in that. Some initiatives have emerged to deal with this situation and assist libraries and guide policy creation and compliance. For example, in 2018, the University of Virginia was awarded a 2-year grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to address the issue of federating repositories of accessible materials. And this, in essence, is talking about what can we do at scale so that we're not all doing the same thing and reinventing the wheel over and over again. And I encourage you to go take a look at that, and we anxiously await the results of that grant, which should be at the end of 2020. Additionally, the Big Ten Academic Alliance, in concert with the Association of Southeastern Research Libraries, or ASERL, has created the Library Accessibility Alliance, and its purpose is to engage with library vendors and initiatives to improve usability for all users. This group provides, again, a scalable solution for testing compliance across vendors. This is something that emerged last year as Hannah and I began the exploration into accessibility. As we're all gathering these voluntary product accessibility templates, there's no need for every single library, every single consortium to do testing on that particular product. Once somebody has done testing to make sure, for example, that an EBSCO product adheres to its voluntary product accessibility template, it's been done once. We don't all need to do that over and over again. And they're trying to come together as larger consortium to create that scalable solution for testing compliance. They also offer model accessibility licensing language for libraries. So if you're involved in the licensing, either at a consortial level or for your library individually, they offer model licensing language so that, again, we don't all have to reinvent the wheel. In addition to the lawsuits, particularly the California Community College lawsuits that Hannah and I both mentioned, legislation was reintroduced to the U.S. House of Representatives late in 2019 to promote the equal access to instructional materials for students with disabilities, and this is called the Accessible Instructional Materials Bill. And while this is always important with the increase of online learning, this has become critical faced with COVID-19 and our current pandemic, as we saw certainly institutions of higher education and our K through 12 move from face-to-face learning to online and remote learning. So what happens with that particular bill is going to be critical. And then finally, just a few other selected resources. This is a link to the actual Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 that allow you to see the actual specific ways you can make your library materials accessible. There's a practical guide to improving web accessibility from the University of Michigan. Michigan State University has some web accessibility tutorials. And then for those of you who are archivists or deal with special collections, there's some information there for archivists at home. And I'm going to turn it back over to Hannah now.
Thank you very much, Jill. So we've thrown a lot of information at you, and it probably feels a little scary. And overwhelming, and a lot of it is focused on compliance. But it's good to think about this from a larger perspective. We put this quote here from Haben Girma, who identifies as a deaf-blind lawyer and activist. And she said, "The barriers exist not in the person, but in the physical, social, and digital environment. People with disabilities and their communities succeed when the community decides to dismantle digital, attitudinal, and physical barriers." So the reason that Haben Girma became a lawyer is because when she first went to college, she did not have access to the menus in the school dining halls. And she went to the cafeteria people and she said, "Is there any chance that this could be emailed to me?" And they said no. And she learned that she had legal rights to be able to get that information. And once she was able to apply legal pressure, she was able to get access to the same information and actually choose the food she ate, which is a crazy thought, that because people would not send you a menu in a format that you could access, that she would just eat whatever was in front of her and hope that it would be something that she liked. And what she's saying here is that the cafeteria, and by a larger view, any of us providing information, when what we're doing is we're creating barriers. Whether we see it as creating barriers or not, we are. No decision that we make is passive. Every decision you make is active. So every time you choose a resource that you want to purchase for your library, whether you're a public library, whether you're an academic library, whether you're an independent research institution, whether you're in the archives or special collections, every decision you make regarding a system or regarding what you place online or regarding what you choose to purchase or financially support is an active decision. If you are thinking, well, this conformance is so overwhelming, all I want to do is just, I just need to get this resource, and that is the most important thing, and we'll deal with accessibility later. That feels sort of passive, but really what you're doing is you're deciding that a subset of your users are actively not going to be able to access that resource. And what this should do is not make you scared or angry, but it should make you want to act. It should make you want to reevaluate every decision that you make around what you offer to your users as an opportunity to provide more access to more people. As we said, this is a central mission of libraries. If our goal is to make information as available to as many people as possible, then every decision is an active opportunity to provide more to more people. And another thing you might be thinking is, well, this is a terrible time to be telling me that, because we're in the middle of a pandemic. My budget is probably going to be cut at least 10%, and everyone is at home and trying to make these incredibly difficult decisions. Everything is incredibly overwhelming right now. Yes, it is. It's a terrible time. But that doesn't mean that it's a bad time to talk about accessibility. In fact, it's a great time to talk about accessibility, because we have to reevaluate everything. If your budget is being cut, now if you have to reevaluate every resource that you purchase anyways, guess what? Use that time to evaluate the accessibility of all of those resources. If you have staff stuck at home, if you're stuck at home and everyone's being told to work on professional development, you know what? Create a working group about training yourself to learn more about accessibility. If you have to talk to faculty if in an academic library about the kinds of resources that they are going to need to teach virtually in the fall, this is a moment of outreach to tell them that not only should they be thinking about what resources are available to their students, but also how you evaluate accessibility of those resources. Use this as a time to teach them about how to choose smarter resources. And finally, desperation is the mother of invention. This is a time, because we're discombobulated, because we're dislocated. If you want to learn more about accessibility, experiment. Download a screen reader to try and empathetically experience what it might be like for someone without full capacity of their without full physical capabilities, to try and experience your website through their experience. Or, you know, if you have collections either in library publishing or institutional repository or archives and special collections, if there are tools you've always wanted to try, use this time to try them, because whatever space might have been taken up by activities in the office that you can't do, now is the time. There's not any risk and there's only opportunity. I have a teacher, her name is Allison Langmead. She's amazing. I had a teacher so Allison was my teacher at the University of Pittsburgh when I got my library degree. And one thing that she said that I've always thought about is, she said, whatever you do right now, in 10 years, someone is going to tell you that you did it wrong. But that should mean that you should never be afraid to try something, because you are always going to make mistakes, especially when people are looking back in hindsight. But you can't let that stop you from doing the work that you need to do, because being inactive is worse than being active and making mistakes. So Jill and I guess our call to action is just take this time to reevaluate and see it as an exciting opportunity to improve and to expand the reach of your library. So Jill asked this question at the beginning of the session. She said, what are your first accessibility action items after today's session? We hope that now you can take a little bit of time to think about it, and we're going to open up the floor to questions soon. If you want to share what you're going to think about, that is wonderful. If it takes you a little bit more time to process, that's perfectly fine. We just want you to keep this question in the back of your mind. And here is a link to our accessibility survey report. I can also put the link in the chat. And now we'll open up the floor to questions. And I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Jill and I can turn our cameras on. And we'll put our emails in the chat as well. Okay.
Thank you, Hannah and Jill. like both Hannah and Jill said, if you do have any questions right now, please go ahead and you can either turn your mute off and ask the question if you would like. You can type it into the chat, or you can use the raise your hand feature to ask a question. And so we'll give you all a minute to see if you have any questions to ask. One of the things I like that you all just said was there's only opportunity. You know, when you're in a situation where you've not done something before, and you think you may need to do it, or there's something you think you should change, or something new you think you should have, thinking of it in that positive way, that there's only opportunities, sort of dissipates some of the angst that may arise when trying to do something new like this. And I guess if I were to ask a question, one of the questions would be, what would you say is one of the best ways to get buy-in for some of these things? You know, when we're dealing with some of our, you know, whoever it is, academic faculty, older lecturers, you know, some of these accessibility measures aren't things that they're used to being required to do, you know, and even when going online for these recent, this recent semester, all professors may have done their classes differently. So how would you say that people can go about getting buy-in?
Jill, I can answer if you want to start.
It doesn't matter. I was just going to briefly say that unfortunately, I think with the proliferation of the lawsuits, that certainly gets the administration, the parent organization administration involved and interested, and then it can lead to policy creation and adherence. I mean, that's waving with or activating with a stick instead of a carrot, or whatever that saying is, but I think that's going to get the attention, certainly, of administrators at the parent organization level. And Hannah, whatever thoughts you may have as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I will admit that legal mandates are a really good threat to get people to pay attention. But also, if you're talking one-on-one with a librarian or an archivist or faculty, you know, someone who has to change their resources, a couple of good arguments. One is that accessibility often benefits everybody. You know, it's sort of a principle of universal design that you want to make items as accessible to as many people as possible, regardless of thinking about disability. So if you think about it physically, the ramps that are on sidewalks that are used to allow wheelchairs to go on sidewalks also benefit people with strollers, also benefit people with suitcases. Closed captions, if you're thinking about audio video resources, closed captions not only benefit those with hearing disabilities, but they also benefit people who are in a crowded place. They benefit people who may need a little help understanding, say, particular accents or regional dialects. You know, everything that you do helps on a different level. Even if you're thinking about archives and special collections, the Helen Keller collection at the National Federation of the Blind, they created really intensive keyword searches to better help those using screen readers zero in on the kind of information that they were trying to find. But what it actually does, it just opens up the collection to even more people, because it allows people to understand better the nuances of Helen Keller's life. So whatever you do in terms of accessibility, it helps not just those with immediate accessibility needs, it helps every single person who is using your resources.
That's something that's really emerged for me, and Hannah mentioned it at the end. To whatever extent you have the bandwidth to try and experience digital materials through a screen reader, through these other types of assistive technologies. Hannah and I tried to do that together over the past year. She's done more of it than I have. It's really an eye-opening experience to sit and experience that from the viewpoint of somebody with limited abilities in a certain area, and how we can improve that. It's that empathetic journey to take, and that's been very eye-opening over the past year to year and a half.
Thank you both for answering that question. And I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I did have one more that I'm wondering if you can answer. You know, there are thousands of libraries out, you know, in the U.S. and many more across the world. Are there any libraries that you think are doing a very good job at accessibility, or ones that maybe you think about when you think of good accessibility in libraries, or even for their websites that they have, ones that you would point to as good ones to take a look at, or even reach out to for questions?
Yeah, I would thank you very much for your questions, Joy. I would say that we actually linked to one of their resources, but Michigan State University, the core mission of the entire university is to be friendly to people with different forms of disabilities. And the whole library is dedicated to making their resources and their physical spaces accessible. And they provide training resources for making web materials accessible. I use their resources in order to try and make our accessibility report accessible, because they were the easiest to understand. And they have a specific department and specific staff dedicated to enforcing accessibility. So I would say they really are a premier model in trying to figure out what to do.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't know. There are no additional questions. Thank you for answering that one. If you have anything that you would like to wrap up and say, we can go ahead and do that now and close out the session.
I just wanted to say quickly, just on a very personal note, about your comment, Joy, that this is an opportunity. I started the presentation with my story about you can now be the copyright person, and I entered librarianship to be an instruction librarian, but suddenly I was learning all about copyright, and before I knew it, it led me down a career path to be an electronic resources librarian, and opened up a whole new, you know, career path for me. So I think viewing this as an opportunity, even in the midst of the pandemic and everything else that's going on, is just a critical way to look at this. So ending on that positive note, that this can be a real opportunity, I think is important.
And thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to present our work to this great audience. Lyricist is actually our home office, although it's not open right now, is based in Atlanta. So it's it's nice to present to the home team, as it were.
Yes, thank you very much for having us.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll sign off there. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.